Welcome to the Dip Dive. Today, we're tackling, well, a really crucial question.
Uh-huh.
What was the landscape of corruption really like in Mauritius between 2019 and 2024?
Right.
We know you want to get informed fast, without drowning in details. So we've boiled down the key findings.
Yeah, from international indices, news reports, global organizations, trying to paint a clear picture for you of that period.
Exactly. So where should we start? Maybe the big picture.
Let's do that. The Corruption Perception Index, the CPI. It measures perceived levels of public sector corruption.
Okay.
And between 2019 and 2024, Mauritius, well, it showed a pretty consistent score, but ultimately kind of stagnant.
Stagnant? How so?
Well, in 2019, the score was 52. It nudged up a tiny bit, 53 in 2020, 54 in 2021.
A slight improvement then.
For a moment, yeah. But then it dipped back to 50 in 2022 and then just settled at 51 for both 2023 and 2024.
Okay, so hovering around that 50 mark, what does that score actually mean in context?
A score around 50 generally indicates a perception that corruption isn't, let's say, rampant, but it's certainly not minimal either. It's moderate.
Right. And how does Mauritius compare regionally and globally with that score?
Good question. It consistently did better than the sub-Saharan Africa average. That average was 33 in 2024.
Okay, quite a bit better then.
Yes. But, and this is important, it remained way behind the top scoring countries.
Yeah.
The ones scoring in the 80s and 90s.
So that raises a key point, doesn't it? This steady but kind of unimproved CPI score. Could it mean that maybe the efforts in Mauritius to fight corruption aren't quite keeping up?
That's a very plausible interpretation. It suggests maybe things aren't worsening dramatically in perception terms, but they aren't significantly improving either, especially compared to global progress.
Interesting. And does this perception match what was actually happening on the ground? What about specific issues or scandals?
Well, when you dig deeper, beyond just the CPI perception, you definitely find recurring issues. Nepotism, for instance.
Yes. In appointments, resource allocation.
Exactly. That theme comes up again and again. And then you have these long-running scandals that just keep casting a shadow.
Like the Labour Party Betamax case.
That's one. Also, the CEB Chinese counterfeit light bulbs case, people sometimes call it Scandal Lampoule.
Right, I remember that. And the MedPoint affair, too.
Yes, that's another one with a long history. These things linger.
And within our specific time frame, 2019 to 2024, were there significant new events?
Absolutely. Things got quite intense. For instance, the arrest of the former Prime Minister, Pravin Jugnauth.
That was actually after his term ended, right? Early 2025.
Correct, in February 2025. But the allegations money laundering related back to his time in office, that 2019-2024 period. A lot of currency found at his home.
Wow, okay. What else?
There were some really heated discussions in the Mauritian National Assembly, particularly about the Lam Shanglin report.
What did that report allege?
It supposedly detailed links between the ruling MSM party and drug trafficking networks. Very serious stuff.
And how did the government react?
Well, the Prime Minister himself actually acknowledged a war against corruption and specifically mentioned the drug economy. So a recognition of the problem, at least publicly.
That is significant. Anything else major?
Yeah, the 2024 phone tapping scandal. That raised big concerns about potential abuse of state surveillance powers, maybe for political reasons.
Surveillance, drug trafficking links. It paints a worrying picture about institutions.
It does. And it connects to persistent worries about corruption within law enforcement itself, especially related to that drug trade we mentioned. It seems to be an undercurrent in a lot of these issues.
Okay, let's shift perspective a bit. What about international views? Specifically, say, the French government, given the close ties.
That's an interesting angle.
Yeah.
We looked into their publicly available reports, from the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs for this period, 2019 to 2024.
Any specific focus on corruption in Mauritius?
Surprisingly, no. Not dedicated reports analyzing systemic corruption. Their focus seemed much more on consular issues, safety of French nationals living there, that sort of thing.
So not a public priority for them in their reports?
Not explicitly, no. And the French anti-corruption agency, the AFA, they mainly focused domestically within France. Mauritius didn't really feature in their reports from that time either.
But does that mean France wasn't concerned at all?
Well, not necessarily. There was a French National Assembly report related to ratifying penal cooperation conventions with Mauritius.
Ah, okay. What did that say?
It highlighted the strong historical, cultural, economic ties, for sure. But importantly, it also pointed to financial crime and drug trafficking as significant areas of mutual concern.
So an indirect acknowledgement. a shared interest in tackling related corruption.
Exactly. It implies cooperation on those fronts, even without a specific corruption in Mauritius report from the Foreign Ministry. The concern is there, just maybe addressed through different channels, like judicial cooperation.
Right. So zooming out even further then, what about other international bodies or local efforts?
Well, locally, you have Transparency Mauritius, part of Transparency International. They're quite active, promoting transparency, running an advice and legal assistance center, the ALASC, for people to report corruption.
That's crucial grassroots work. And major global players like the World Bank?
The World Bank's focus during this period seemed more geared towards economic development, helping Mauritius transition to a knowledge-based economy. We didn't find specific World Bank reports zeroing in on corruption there between 2019 and 2024.
Okay. But Mauritius is part of international anti-corruption frameworks, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a signatory to the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCDG, so it's part of that review process.
The regional bodies.
Yes, it ratified the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, the AUCPCC. It participates actively in AU anti-corruption talks. And interestingly, a UNCTAD report noted Mauritius had relatively stronger resilience to economic shocks, including in governance, compared to some other African nations.
Resilient governance noted by UNCTAD. Any OECD involvement?
Yep. The OECD has engaged with Mauritius on financial integrity and anti-corruption. Think workshops, initiatives with the African Development Bank. Mauritius is actually listed in an OECD report on transnational corruption, too.
So, plenty of international engagement and frameworks in place, but what about the effectiveness of Mauritius's own institutions? You mentioned ICAC earlier.
Right, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, ISTAC, and the Economic Crime Office, ECO. There are ongoing concerns about their actual effectiveness and, crucially, their independence.
Independence is key for trust, isn't it?
Absolutely. And remember that comment I mentioned from a former U.S. ambassador? Stating ISAC had lost credibility. That's quite a statement.
It really is. What other challenges persist?
Well, the slow pace of justice in corruption cases is a big one. Cases can drag on for years. And those persistent issues we talked about, nepotism, favoritism in politics, they haven't gone away.
Any external indices confirm these institutional worries?
Yes, the Bertelsmann Foundation's Transformation Index, the BTI. Their reports raise concerns about increasing politicization of key institutions.
Politicization of which ones?
Including the anti-corruption bodies themselves, like IC, but also the police, even the judiciary. That kind of thing really risks undermining public trust.
So let's try and tie this all together. It seems a bit contradictory, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, you have this relatively stable, moderate CPI score. But alongside that, numerous serious allegations, high-profile arrests, concerns about institutional independence, persistent nepotism.
It is a complex picture. The perception measured by the CPI might not capture the full depth or nature of the problem on the ground.
Right. So summarizing, while the perception of corruption in Mauritius held sort of steady between 2019 and 2024, the reality seems, well, much more challenging. Significant allegations, particularly at high levels, persist.
Exactly. And the lack of, say, specific public French government reports doesn't negate those domestic concerns or the findings of other international bodies. The work of Mauritian civil society and these international organizations remains vital.
Definitely.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. When you consider this relatively stable CPI score alongside all these numerous, quite serious corruption allegations we've touched on, what does that tell you? Perhaps about the limitations of relying only on perception-based indices to really grasp and fight corruption. It really makes you think about how crucial genuine transparency is and how much we need truly independent institutions and robust international cooperation to tackle what is, after all, a deeply complex global issue.